And now for this evening's talk. Delighted to welcome back Luca, who will talk on Whence, Chappism. Thank you.
On that side, all right. Forgive that there's a bee, but I was getting too warm, and you don't want to see somebody here melting in front of the lights. So, very honored to be giving the inaugural blah blah in the new location, and you'll be delighted to hear it's a short presentation and entirely unintellectual. So, which one is the advanced button? This one?
That one should go.
That one there?
Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, basically because there is, it's not a serious subject, and there isn't a bibliography or anything like that, so I couldn't spend the usual sort of 35 minutes on Wikipedia finding out facts or anything like that. So we're going to talk about the origins and the creation myths surrounding Chappism. What are there precedents, are there parallels? I was interested in something that I've been interested in a while, people that seem to conform to this habit, this harmless eccentricity before the late 20th century, so earlier in the 20th century. So pioneers of Chappism, some enablers, some people that have been, I think, I didn't realize that was such a loaded word. Obviously that made it possible or easier to indulge this minor habit. And then I was going to draw your attention to how nostalgia changed in the 1980s, I think figuratively and to some extent, even culturally, and I think that fed into it. And then we're going to ask ourselves whether Chappism has legs, whether it's going to last or whether it's going to die out very, very soon. So I have a few slides from the first presentation I gave about this extremely serious topic. And the idea of, we're just defining Chappism very much in the style of the Sheridan Club and the Flaneur Walk and things of that sort, where there is this harking back to the styles and mannerisms and to some extent, not so much the values, but the way of presenting oneself and conducting oneself in the past. And so there's an inherent critique of certain aspects of modernity as we're experiencing it today. So things like the tweed run, where there was no lycra allowed and everybody wearing tweed as if it was 1910, writing and protests against the abasement of Savile Row. And you might remember, those of you who saw it, that we talked about there are four main streams or considerations or motivations behind people getting involved in this kind of activity. And one is just the desire to stand out from the undifferentiated great crowd. Others are more just about the sheer aesthetic appeal of it. And so even if everyone else was a chap or a chapette, they would still be very happy to engage with it. It's not that they want to stand out, they just think it looks nicer, it feels nicer. And then, of course, there's some people that have the appeal is traditionalism. They think that modern society is too vulgar, it's too fast, it's too whatever. And then there's also progressive, which I think a lot of people in the Sheridan Club adhere to. They think that early modernity had held some promise for progress on a number of levels, and it was traduced by the way it developed in later decades in the neoliberal world. And so there are very different ways of coming to Chappism. And if you might remember that the idea was that some of these elements are present in most people's attraction to this kind of activity, but obviously some more than others. So the first thing I wanted to point out historically is that the idea of retrocentricity, of looking towards the past and reinterpreting it and wearing it and enjoying it is nothing new. 18th century dress, for fancy dress, was extremely popular in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and it even inspired clothes that were meant to be worn. Sorry, I keep doing that. This chair. Not on a fancy dress ball like that dress by Worth, which is inspired by 18th century models. So that's always been with us. I found this picture a couple of years ago. It's an extraordinary picture taken in 1939 of someone, I think in St. Louis in the United States, that went about dressed as his interpretation of a 19th century gentleman. It must have turned a few heads because obviously people didn't dress like that in 1939 St. Louis. And even later after the war, some of the styles that were adopted in some of the Ivy League and just all kinds of environments were clearly a bit backward looking in terms of combining certain elements of dress, but also, I think, speech and the kind of literature they might be interested in. And it wasn't just as a sort of grassroots or commercial level. There are certain figures like Lucius Beebe, some I think many of you will know. I think maybe one time we'll do a presentation about this gentleman. He was a very interesting journalist who wrote very light-hearted pieces about society, and so you can say he's a society journalist, which is a very lightweight type of journalist, but I think he had a better sense of humor, and he would observe how some aspects of luxury and the upper classes had changed through time, and he was always harking back to an earlier time and saying that things were a bit more genteel and a bit more elegant and so forth. When private train carriages were becoming a thing of the past, he bought 2 or 3, and he actually somehow persuaded, because he was a prominent person, there were companies to still do that, to attach one of his wagons on the way someplace. And there's this famous picture here also in Life magazine, I believe, where he's standing there in white tie at a time when it was beginning to really disappear. So that's not new. But I think that just liking past styles and past mannerisms is more generic and broader than Chappism specifically. And I think the way it's often presented is that you have an element of historical dandyism, like the early 19th century and later dandies and the incroyable in France, and then also an element of being interested in style in general, in fashion, and alternative, and so then all that feeds into Chappism, and I think that's a bit simple. I think the process was a little bit more complicated and more specific to this individual subculture. So the way I see it is that you have this interest in retro styles, which, as we said, is not new. It's always been there, certainly, let's say, in late modernity. And you have, and that's very much a 20th century style, I think, to a greater extent, the idea of alternative styles. So styles that are, Beau Brummel didn't want to stand out too much. He was trying to lead the rest of society towards his style of dressing. But people like the Zazoos and the hippies were more about doing their own thing, whether people liked it or not. And so standing outside, like the eccentric that we talked about before, and possibly the progressive, outside of the mainstream of society. So I think this thing combined very late in the 20th century, and they gave rise to a number of I guess, style tribes or phenomena, including the hipsters and reenactors and cosplay. And I think Chappism is one of those. It has specific characteristics that differentiate it from the others, but it shares some of the origin and some of the thinking, I think, some of the cultural reactions. Sorry, going back. So I think vintage, as we think of vintage, as opposed to just somebody wearing a costume or a designer drawing inspiration from the past, but people actually looking for old boulders and old shoes and old objects, doing their house up as if it was a Victorian house, using old record players and so forth, is a very recent thing, and to a great degree does stem from the counterculture revolution of the late 60s, because that marks a real break in the history of our culture, whereby what is desirable, what is cool, what people want to do, especially young people, is no longer so top-down. I mean, eventually gets taken over by mass media and commercialism, but certainly the spirit of the counterculture was that young people and people that maybe had been more marginal, like African Americans and Native Americans and all kinds of people, formerly colonized people, had something interesting to contribute, and it would be more grassroots and up, and you'd have this greater freedom to act in your life as long as you weren't hurting anyone, as you please, and obviously that covered lifestyle and style and the way you presented yourself. So the idea of that top-down cultural norms are no longer universal, and that it's not just a few weird freaks that refuse that, but by large swathes of society. Now, the reaction to that obviously was mixed. And that, too, I think, feeds into how we experience Chappism nowadays. So some people were delighted by this, and some people not so much. And what that meant is that they both fed into it. What do I mean by that? On the one hand, you have this idea from the late 60s and 70s that how you dress, how you present yourself is your business, and it carries less impact. There's a much higher threshold of negative consequences than 20 years before. I'm sure that chap there that we saw from 1939, I don't know what he did for a living, but it would have been quite difficult to be like that in the 40s, in the 50s, in the early 60s. And I think after the countercultural revolution, even if you're not a hippie, there's all kinds of liberation movements where you can say, look, this is my business, what I do, and you're not going to be able to sack me because of it, or think that I'm crazy, or that I'm not respectable. And at the same time, because a lot of people interpreted that freedom in a way that was aesthetically, and I think even in terms of general deportment, less formal and less put together and less considered, there's a conservative reaction to that, which I think we saw coming through in the 1980s. And so I think that Chappism has some conservative and actually quite liberal individualist elements mixed together in it. So what are some of the pioneers that I talked about? And by the way, this is just people that I've run into by reading articles and so forth. I'd be delighted if people, after the presentation, were able to point me to others that I think come from the same period and that contributed and were kind of precursors of what we see as Chappism. There was this chap, an American guy, and almost all of these people were in the arts in some way or another, which you would expect. So he was an illustrator, he was an artist, he wrote about the arts, and I think he very much encapsulates the kind of Chappist spirit in the sense that, he just wanted to, he liked the way the clothes look. This is a great quote. My sartorial aspirations lie somewhere between the Duke of Windsor and Duke Ellington. So, jazz, aristocracy, but obviously all from the past. And, he started dressing like this. The pictures I have are mostly more recent because they come from the web. But I think in the early 1970s, where it was really not fashionable at all, and he really stood out, but you could get away with it in New York.
Tijuana Bible? Could you please explain?
A Tijuana Bible is a sort of very crudely put together guidebook to the delights of Tijuana. So where to go to get drunk, where to go to have good food, where to go to do things that you probably should only do with your wife, and so on and so forth. As a little aside, I read a story last year about a man who had contracted a terminal disease, poor chap, and he didn't have much to go on and didn't have a lot of family, or he wasn't working any longer, and so he decided to end it. But before that, he took a bunch of his savings out, which obviously didn't need anymore because he wasn't going to last. And he went to Tijuana, and he had a hell of a weekend, fueled mostly by cocaine and prostitutes, and he decided not to kill himself. True story. So he went through the rest of his savings first, use them properly. Another very interesting guy is Jacques Debachet, who was for many, many, many years Lagerfeld's romantic partner. And I think is sometimes dismissed as a sort of good-looking chap that went to lots of parties and drank a lot of champagne, but actually made some very interesting short films, and he had this incredible sense of style. And at a time when a lot of people, I think, were trying to, I don't want to say dumb down, but make things always more informal and always more, easily approachable. He liked doing things properly and dressing up and so forth, and I think he was quite an influence. And I don't think he was as self-consciously retro in his look, but he was incidentally retro in his look in the sense that he liked to look in a certain way, and so he's moving away from mainstream fashion. These two artists, also USians, very, very interesting. They were quite modern, conceptual artists. They were partners for many, many years, and they adopted this idea of living as if they were in the 1910s for a period of years. So the building they were in, the artistic materials they used, so the techniques, they drove a Ford Model T, and they dressed like that in 1980s New York. And and this is my favorite, I don't know if you want to call it Chappist or retroist quote, but I've seen the future and I'm not going. I've stolen that and I've used it many times, although I attribute it to, I think it was MacGuff. Anyway, very, very interesting people, interesting life. They wrote a book, which I recommend. Much less well known, I think, is a British chap who at some point in the 70s decided that the kind of clothes that we all admire were nicer. And although he was kind of he was an artist, he was immersed in the counterculture, and he used to go to punk concerts dressed like this. I think he got beat up once or twice, or got threatened a couple of times. And he said that he was featured in the dandy book. He said, yeah, just essentially, I just like dressing up from earlier times because it looks good, and that's why I'm doing it. There's no deep measure of some philosophy or anything like that. So I think he's a bit of a precursor because again he started that early. And then I think most British people here will be familiar with Billy Childish, who's a musician and a painter and just about everything. And I think he had a very much this style, again, from a very artistic, creative point of view. But I think if you look at things like, he was briefly involved in this movement called Stuckism because his former girlfriend, Tracy Emin, said, that he was stuck with painting things that people could recognize. And, he said, well, if artists who don't paint aren't artists. And so he named the movement Stuckism. And he moved on after that. But very, very interesting character. And if you look at the music that he's producing, it's very kind of, punkish, new wave-ish. So not very traditional at all, and he's not a traditional guy in any way, the way he's led his life. But it's got this fantastic retro style, and I think of him as. So I think these are some of the pioneers, and I'd be very interested afterwards in hearing some people that you think could be said to have adopted this mentality or this approach or this interest before it was a wider, more encompassing movement. How about the enablers? So first of all, Keith McNally, famous restaurateur. I hope all of you, but at least some of you will have seen my old website, Wonderland City, and some of the places that I covered in it. Places like the Woolsey, and there's dozens of places like that now in London. By the 70s, the grand old dames of turn of the century and golden era entertainment and hospitality were usually looking pretty sad and pretty sorry for themselves, and they're completely out of fashion. And people wanted, shinier, newer, excluding in the 1980s, more plasticky. The first person that created a new place, so brand new, not falling to bits, that looked like it could have been from the 30s, was McNally at the Odeon not downtown New York, but near the Flatiron Building. And I went there quite a few years after it opened, and it really was a special buzz to that place. And I think there's since opened a bunch of places, including Balthazar, which is very retro looking. I don't recommend the one in London, but the one in New York is very nice. It's great being involved in this kind of activity or interest or look, but if you're sitting in a McDonald's, there's something missing. And I think it's very important there were people that created places where, whether they were historical or newly created. You have to think of Fisher's here in London, where it just goes together really well. And I think you get this sense of Gesamtkunstwerk, where there's the intention, there's the look, there's the place, ideally maybe even the music, and so it all goes together in a lovely way. It's quite synergistic. And of course, here in London, Corbin and King. I think the opening of the Woolsey really marked a step, and it's influenced the look of hospitality and the approach to it, I think, including quite good service. They always have really, really good service. And by London standards, they're not even too rapaciously expensive. I mean, they're a lot more expensive places than their places, especially considering how lovely they look, right? So we've organized a couple of things. At the Delaunay, I was always struck that cocktails cost half what the ones at the former Pearl Assurance Hotel, the one on Holborn costs, which, who wants to pay £26 for one cocktail? I don't. So I think that was they had a very, very big influence on that, and they obviously loved that aesthetic. And this is actually, I'm self-quoting, which is unforgivable, but the idea to me is that these places where if you walked in, wearing evening dress with your partner, with friends, you wouldn't look outrageously out of place. You look like you fit there, regardless of the fact that everybody else was in trainers. That's fine. That's their choice. That's how they want to live. That's wonderful. But that's right. We are inheritors of the counterculture in this sense, and so we're not there to judge other people, but we like to do it differently. And you can do it there, and you can look and do it in a way that is consistent. Of course, there's a Chap magazine. I mean, I wouldn't be saying Chappism without the Chap magazine, and lots of people have contributed to it in this room. Obviously, Gustav Temple and Vic Darkwood started it in 1999. It's been going for 25 years. That's quite an achievement. And at one point, as Hartley knows, I was thinking of doing a publication, not like the Chap, but about this kind of interest. There's a lot involved, and I think we should always be grateful for people that can keep something like that going for very long, and create a point of aggregation for people with our interest. And obviously organizing the Gantler Walk, and hopefully again, as formerly here, but apparently the Chap Olympiad might be coming back, so great. Another major enabler has been, the Speakeasy 1920s, Great Gatsby parties, the Jazz Age Long Party, which is a very big thing, but it's once a year, and then you have, of course, the wonderful. Is it twice a year now?
They have two. They have June
It's
and
gotten,
August.
oh, okay, so it's gotten so big. Okay,
Yeah.
I was stuck back at the one in August. And the Candlelight Club, which has been going for nearly 15 years. I think September we have, right? Again, I think that constancy, keeping something like that going and not just doing it for a year or two has allowed people with this interest to really enjoy it, but also to kind of keep it foremost. And I think culturally to have an impact on how things are done outside of the strict realm of. And so I think in parties and hospitalities, these things have an impact even where, for people that don't do it all the time or it's not their major interest. We had things like the Tweed Run and so forth. So now I'm going to talk very briefly about Chappism in the 1980s. And the reason I'm going to do that is because, like a few people here, I sort of came of age in the 1980s. And I don't like the way people talk about the 1980s now. I think it's very monodimensional and very, very reductive, So people think of the 1980s, they think of big hair and big shoulders, and very glitzy. And there was that, obviously. But, this is Hollywood, right? It's not the real world. It had an influence. And, I'm sure all the ladies here who were around then will remember. I mean, I used to date a girl that had shoulder pads under a T-shirt. I mean, the shoulder pads in everything. So there was a bit of that. And, for the guys, right? You had this very, very colorful, very demonstrative, very of the moment look like the chaps in Miami Vice, and then the more lamentable examples here, of kind of wild colors and so forth. So, we can't deny that existed. There was this kind of fashion-forward thing where it's very bold and very out there. And you could say, and the fashion changes, and I'm not a fashion historian, but obviously you can like or dislike how people dress in the 80s, the 60s, the 70s, blah, blah, blah. But in a way, it's just this kind of one thing after another, and it's not leading to a change in how a subculture, it's not lasting. People were dressed like this for a while, and then it was the 90s, and everybody wanted to have super, super baggy everything. Okay, fine, and the shoulder pads went. But this was also the 80s, right? And if you look at, so these are from Ralph Lauren ads. I think they're very elegant. There's an element of formality, even though they're kind of preppy-ish, ivy-ish, so also a bit informal and sporty. And the way they're put together and the way they're photographed is clearly retrocentric. I mean, it's clearly harking back to a different age, a different sort of elegance and so forth. Obviously in a very, kind of fantasy world of the past, right? Because of course, as you know, Ralph Lauren, for instance, was one of the first really, really major mass market producers to put a lot of black people in ads from the late 80s onward. In the 20s, they were in a different set. But fine, that's gone, thank God. And so he was creating this fantasy world in which, in Lisa Burnak's world, everybody can be upper class. Well, it's opposite. And these are some Giorgio Armani pictures, and this was also the 80s, which is more 40s influence, I think, than Ralph Lauren. But it was, I think, elegant, and it was restrained, and it was saying, okay, that's fine. We did this experiment with, everybody wears polyester all the time and strange hair and whatever. And now you can also choose to look differently. And it was very much inspired by the past. But I think without any desire to go back to the past as such, but just really from an aesthetic point of view. And these are other ads from that period from less well-known designers, that it was quite, it had a huge influence. It didn't just last for a moment. And I think that the part of the reason that these styles stayed with us and influenced Chappism is that there was a special kind of nostalgia in the 80s. So you have aspects from the overall culture. So there was an element in the 1980s, for instance, in politics and in economics, a kind of almost reactionary movement, I guess, what some people perceived as excesses of the 60s and 70s. partly it was just fashion cyclical because people do one thing and they want to try another one, and you can't just keep it forever, especially from the commercial imperative is to keep changing and get you to buy new things. But I think there were also, from a graphic and visual point of view, some interesting developments. So the way that the early part, what we might call the golden era, stylistically, the early part of the 20th century was portrayed, became much more, I would say, realistic, but more importantly, it was done with a lot more taste. It wasn't, didn't people in the 1910s look funny? Didn't people in the 1920s look funny? It was more like, they look kind of nice, and it was filmed, I think, more lovingly, more affectionately, and it was less caricature. And I'm going to give you a few examples here. So, if you look at Hollywood movie costumes portraying the early 20th century, in the mid-20th century, they're jokey, right? A lot of people like Easter Parade, but most of the costumes, and I'm not, the people here are professional, in our club, they're professional costume makers and whatever, but, they're risible. I mean, they look nothing like the clothes they wore back then, and they're very Broadway show busy, And I got this fantastic picture of Steve Martin and Jerry Lewis clearly trying to look as clownish as possible, wearing turn of the century, quote-unquote, clothes. And even My Fair Lady and Mary Poppins, it's a caricature of that period. And I think it's because it was relatively close. I think if you were making a show now about something that happened in the 80s or the 70s, you'd go for the big shoulder pads and the big hair.
That often, instead of Singing in the Rain,
right?
Doing the 1920s pastiche.
Right, okay, so
exactly the same
it's relatively close, right? The people that were doing the pastiche, and they experienced the 20s directly, right? They're around,
Yeah.
And so it was a kind of like a theme party, but not a very well-organized theme party. Now we go to 1980s. Look how this portrayed. A movie like Chariots of Fire, right? They look like clothes of that period. And, it's a very good film, I think, and it doesn't present the period as for your problems. If you remember, some of the characters encounter quite a bit of prejudice, for instance, and there are all kinds of dynamics. But it's portrayed in a way that if you were coming to this as a young person, as I did, it wasn't like, oh my God, look at these freaky-looking people. It was more like, these people look a lot better than everyone else I know. Reds, again, I think underestimated in terms of the visual impact and the costume, because obviously it was more politically charged, but it was very nice in that way. And of course, in 1981, these are only 1981s, Brideshead Revisited, and I think, for me, that was sort of my gateway drug into all this nonsense. Because it was hours and hours and hours, right? And it looked so lovely, I wanted to have a teddy bear and go to Oxford, not to study, but to eat plover's eggs and so forth. And then, of course, there were the Merchant Ivory films, Room with a View, and I don't think it's accidental that at that point in history, partly because of the passage of time, partly because of some of the things that happened in the 70s and so forth, partly because of some of the things that were happening in politics in the 80s, which was, a synthesis of what had come before, we get this different way of representing the past, especially from a visual point of view, as more desirable and not comical. And a film that I thought, for me, was quite influential and a lot of people liked was Metropolitan. And what was special about Metropolitan is that it never says when it takes place. So it says New York not so long ago. And the film came out, I believe, in 1990. And the thing that to me was powerful about this is that it illustrated people looking, wearing white tie and being elegant and having a certain way of carrying themselves, but not in the distant past, but today or recently. And so, maybe something that we could do, and not just say, wasn't it lovely, 1930s, how they waltz about. Now, this change in the presentation of certain aspects of lifestyle and style and had a huge impact in the 80s. And you can see how you change from the late 70s to the mid to late 80s in pop music. This is obviously David Bowie, starts off extremely interesting and it's the best music in my opinion. But he really evolved a very, very different style as time went by. Brian Ferry, same thing, right? Started off glam rock, I don't know what this guy here, Brian E, I think is doing with that. But, you know, and then it got super smooth, you know, almost James Bondy, but a bit less rapey, kind of, look there, you know, and very very sort of suave, and that occurred, you know, almost all the artists of that period did that to some degree. I mean, there were still some holdouts that, you know, the proper old school rock and roll look and so forth, and that's great. But a lot of pop artists that weren't tied to that look historically, even some that had been, you know, you can see some fantastic ways in you know, the specials. I mean, you know, there's, you know, they were anything but Thatcherite, whether the opposite, whether they're against all that stuff. But the way they present themselves in this video is quite interesting. And so that brings us to the penultimate bit of the presentation, which is, what is the influence of, let's say, not the cinematic, but the commercial manifestation of certain style trends in the 80s and the impact it's had on Chappism. Now, you're all familiar with Ivy style. You know, it's important, I think, in the sense that it was one of the first styles that was a youth style, and it was fairly widespread. Until that period, young men at uni tried to look like their parents or their older brothers, and the women that attended like their older sisters or mothers, to some degree. There were youth styles, but they weren't so well defined, especially by the time you got to be 19, 20, you know, you weren't supposed to look like a kid anymore. The Ivy style is interesting because it's elegant, it's put together, but it's definitely more youth-oriented and at the time considered a bit more informal, more sporty, more approachable, and so forth. So it starts in the 20s and 30s, and it got super popular in the 50s and 60s. It became a widespread style in the US. It influenced style in this country and many others. It was so popular that, you know, jazz artists, a lot of jazz artists were wearing Ivy style clothes, which, you know, is not an association we make through most of the history of jazz music. And by the late 1970s, it was basically, you know, I mean, there were obviously a few people in some little enclave, but it was extremely, extremely unpopular. And if you look at, as a really good way to track how people really dress is US, and I suppose also UK or any place where they take them, class pictures in places where people don't wear uniforms. You know, you can see people that went to very preppy and Ivy places in 72, 73, 75, you know, and they'll look like they're part of the Jig Giles band, or you know, they got long hair, they've got the kipper ties, and so on and so forth. They've gone with the flow, and it made this comeback in the 80s. And obviously, from aesthetically, it was conservative, or I would say even reactionary, and very Anglophile. You know, although it's got its own tropes that are separate from English style, but as a style. And you know, it really got started with a book that was meant to be a humorous book, the official Preppy Handbook of 1980, which obviously I bought and perused. As a mass market fad, it was actually very short-lived. I mean, it was a big thing, you know, you could buy all kinds of items and people, but it had an enduring effect, I think, on how people dress and how people think about the alternation of fashions by decade, because it was a retrograde fashion that to some degree has stayed. Now, I think from a UK perspective, there was always a greater conservatism, certainly in people that work in the professional classes and so forth. And so I've seen here, thanks to some very well-dressed gentlemen that have, you know, vintage clothes from the 40s and 50s, that in the 40s and 50s, some of the extremes of world fashion, like, you know, the lapels going huge and then tiny, didn't happen so much in the UK, or not as much. So some of these might surprise some of you, but almost all these items outside of the UK had basically disappeared by the late 70s. They were basically brought back by these films and by the preppy aesthetic. So, you know, people had completely stopped wearing wing collars. You know, evening wear outside of the UK was, you know, much less common than it became later, and so on and so forth. So a lot of things, and some of these things have lasted, not for everyone, but certainly they're more widespread and easier to find than they would have been if the trend had not been averted. And of course, there's a lot of imitations of the Preppy Handbook. You know, you had the Sloan Handbook, which was funnier than the Preppy Handbook, perhaps a little bit more pointed, and the Young Fogey Handbook and a bunch of other ones, which were just kind of copycat things, but I think spread some of these ideas and concepts. So that's my presentation about where we come from and some of the influences, and again, I'm very interested in opposing or additional opinions. Now, where is it going? I think there are some positive signs. I think if you look at how popular some of these retro-themed events, like Goodwood Revival, seems to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. The Flower Walk seems to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. You know, there's still very good attendance at the parties and then at the theme nights and so forth. And underlying all this, I think the power of the internet to aggregate people from all kinds of parts of the world with a given interest, whatever that may be, innocent, as in our case, and less innocent ones too. But it's, you know, it's got a super aggregating power, and to use Wa's terms, a coding power, i.e. creating a standard for essentially a subculture without the need for a lot of physical manifestations. And so, and not just people in London, they can, or New York or places like that have easy access to the events, but you know, I'm sure all of you follow or see people on Instagram that live in the back of beyond and have this amazing way of interpreting this hobby or this lifestyle, despite the fact they're very distant. And I don't think that would be possible without the internet. But there are also, I think, some trends that argue against this continuing. I mean, generally speaking, there's been a very long, multi-decade trend towards informality. You know, so I'm not saying it's good or bad, but you know, less and less organization and formality and everything. So if you think about how professional people dressed, you know, it went from this to this, and that lasted for several decades, minus the hats. And then we lost the tie, and that's how professionals dress like nowadays. And you know, I don't think that as that becomes further and further, I think that the people that dress, even someone in the short sleeves and you know, because not properly formal, will become more and more eccentric, and so some people might fall by the wayside and think that's not worth it anymore, and so forth. And it's not just in clothing; it's in everything. There was an article a couple of years ago about a busy mom, you know, and so we can understand why she did that. Who once a week had something like taco night for the children, and in order not to do the dishes and the cutlery and all that, you just put some silver paper on the table and put all the ingredients there. They eat with their hands, and then at the end of it, they just crumple it up and throw it away. So that's a very informal way of doing things. It's very practical. It's convenience oriented, and of course that didn't used to be the case. And so, you know, people who smoke a pipe, or you know, have shoes that you have to shine and so forth. You know, the society is trending further and further away from that. So I was trying to illustrate here what a middle to lower middle class table might look like in mid-century, late 20th century, and apparently now. The other thing is that there's still, you know, this incredible association between certain ways of presenting yourself and privilege and exclusivity, right? So this was just, I once did just a simple image search on Google for snob or snobbish, and that's what came up. So these are some of the images that came up. Now, part of it is a facial expression, right? They're sneering and looking down their nose at people. But look how they're dressed, right? They're dressed in old-fashioned ways or in elegant ways and so forth. So there's definitely this idea that if you wear a tie, you know, you're the man, you're this. And we see it in our interest group, where people with the buttons, you know, was it vintage style, not vintage values. So trying to reassure people that you can wear a bow tie without being a member of the KKK, you know, or a woman can wear a skirt without thinking, and still think that they should be able to vote, you know. So, but that I think is detrimental to things. Now, what's going to happen? I don't know. You know, as Yogi Berra said, it's very difficult to make predictions about the future. And this was again an illustration that came in Life magazine in 1914 or 15, I think. And you can see they didn't get it very well, how people would dress in 1950. I think they were a little bit fast there. But the idea is that they're dressed very different, and they're looking at people dressed properly for 1914 and saying, don't they look funny when they're 1914 clothes, right? Right. Now, there are a couple of things that are actually accurate, although 50 years ahead of their time. They're not wearing a lot of clothes. The guy's got tats all over, right? So, you know, they can see the direction, right?
And he has a cane, which I think is quite impressive.
Yeah. He's got a cane, and he's got a plumed hat, so that was just kind of fanciful, you know, whatever, you know. Yes. And, yeah.
And she's smoking a pipe, I didn't realize.
Oh, that's right, yeah, she's smoking a pipe. And is it tobacco? We don't know, you know. So you'll be happy to know that we're coming very, very quickly to the end of this. And so that's the end.
Oh.
Any questions? Yeah, it's wonderful talk. Lady Tan is a lady, Chappism, she has lots of posts on Instagram, but she also does I think she has a site called the Mayfair Eccentrics, and she won Eccentric of the Year and several years ago at the Eccentric Club. So it's well worth sort of checking up on her style, and she writes very interesting things. She hangs around with lots of high fashion people. She's a very
Time Tyne.
Tyne, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I know.
Mayfair Eccentric.
Time.
I met her several times at the Eccentric Club in 2017.
Any obvious whoppers? Any major mistakes that you think in this very, very lightweight analysis?
No,
Could I have mentioned the Teddy Boys a bit more? Teddy Boys and Teddy Girls a little bit. Because of their wanting to be more Edwardian in an era where that.
So I know very little about it because I've seen dozens of articles that always repeat the same three
But
things.
the Teddy Girls are
Why
more
did they
rare.
want to look more Edwardian?
That's the question, isn't it? Yeah,
Was it ever explained?
To look good, the smartness.
Okay, so it was
the
aesthetic.
Tailoring, the smartness, yeah.
What I
Same
read
with
is
the
it was
girls.
actually something which came down from the upper class, that it was actually well off Teddy Boys who. I don't know, it was from the Guardsman look.
That's right.
Okay, like Bunny, what's his
And then
name?
it came, like Bunny Rogers, and it came down from them to.
Okay, so it's still a top-down. It's a pre.
It is,
what
but
I
it's the,
hear.
Okay,
the tailoring
okay.
was affordable if they went to say like Burton's, for example. They could afford that level of tailoring that was only enjoyed really by the upper classes. They could get something like that, get close to it, touch it. They could touch that level of quality. And the Teddy Girls were the same really with what they were trying to do. So, and they're more rare, but they
Yes.
were looking back as well, but trying to be that stylish and bucking against the trend.
Because as they became a sort of youth group, there was a bit of a moral sort of panic about the Teddy Boys, where they were supposed to be.
Yeah, but how much of that is a myth?
No, but at the
High
time,
myth.
I mean, there was.
yeah.
I mean, I've seen some reproduction of certain headlines where
Of course,
sort
of
of like
course.
carry razors.
Yeah.
In a way, what they were doing was a deliberate challenge, not just by looking different, but by trying to look opulent. By
Yes.
saying,
Yeah.
Not
I'm
knowing their
working class,
place.
but look at me.
Yeah.
Not knowing their
And that's-
place.
Yeah, I don't know my place.
Yeah.
I think it was also challenging personal austerity,
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, long
Rations.
things. Yeah.
and
Like-
then so did
like the
Dior's
zoot
new
suits.
look.
Like the zoot suits, which were supposed to challenge, like.
Yeah. But you could afford the Teddy Boys.
I think also the corporate
Yeah.
dress had changed a lot. I mean, in the 70s, you could wear a lot sort of wilder clothes, and then in the 80s, it became more standardised. I still think it's a bit standardised. I don't know.
No, it's getting very bad. I actually had an interview 1 year ago with someone wearing a hoodie, and I was thinking about reporting it to HR because it was an offence. Because I'm taking my time to prepare for the interview, to dress well, to show I'm respecting you as a prospective employer, and the person interviewing me was wearing a hoodie.
But,
it
you
was
know,
a bit humiliating, and it's like,
If you're not eccentric, if you are, there's still a lot of conventionalism, right, in large companies, and so
Yeah.
I have a friend who is, extremely high-level professional, and at one point they were doing something in fintech, and he went to see some people, and his partner in business said, "You need to take your tie off.
Yeah.
You need to take your tie off now because you will not look credible if you're wearing a tie." And I think, right? And so, at some point, if you're going to towards the end of my city career, I wouldn't wear a club cover to see a client. I wouldn't wear a tweed waistcoat to see a client because I don't want clients to remember me by my clothes, right? Or I remember because I'm, bloody clever or whatever, right? And so you have to kind of dumb it down. Like you could still wear a suit and a tie. I had one client show up. You think the hoodie's bad? This guy's wearing Pikachu slippers. He went to see him. Pikachu slippers. And my reaction, and obviously I didn't want to make him uneasy. So he actually said I was older than he was, and so he said, "Really sorry about these." I said, "You're the client. I don't care. You just give us money." But yeah. Sorry, Ed,
I was at Deloitte for 12 years and people dressed like that bloke.
I think the interesting thing about this is the idea of clothing as a form of rebellion, whether that's the zoot suiters rebelling against rationing and the approach of a country because most of them weren't white, treated them as second-class citizens.
yeah, sure.
Teddy Boys, mods, a lot of that is about the working classes saying that's good enough for us too, which I've always seen as a bit of a theme coming through in Chappism, reaching for what. But on that sort of note, you know, now that we're 30, 40 years into the attitude of some of our betters being they can show they've made it when they dress like, you know, a child of 6 like Elon Musk, and that's what's being shown off as success. I think there's a real chance that this corporate dressing down, now the man no longer demands you wear a suit and tie, now the man says wear a hoodie like me.
Yeah, like this.
Maybe now
Fucking
there's a
GAs.
chance for the tie and the suit to have a comeback because people will choose it because it's no longer expected. It is now
A crazy
a
hippie for wearing
rebellion in a sense. So, you know,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think chaps are potentially significantly ahead of a curve that might be about to become on the rise.
But a lot of millionaires in Brazil, what they do is they wear like jeans and t-shirts so they don't get mugged. Because if you wear a suit, you
Okay, that's different, yeah.
So it's slightly.
But yeah, it's the Musk's issue there.
I always think it's interesting in this country, if we dress like this, how often you'll get stopped in the street by people who say, you know, really like, and it's just, I like that, or that's a really cool hat. I mean, I had this today. He actually did, that's a really hard hat. Is hard meaning good? I don't know. It wasn't hard. It's not bad.
One thing that I
Well, the
find
people that say
interesting is the tendency to go for oversized tailoring in fashion. You showed one of your slides, the 80s suit with the incredibly
Yeah.
exaggerated shoulders and nipped in at the waist. Same thing with the zoot suits, to a lesser extent the Teddy Boys. Only today, I was in a BP filling station next door to the office, and there was a young lady in the queue in front of me, and she had a very oversized gentleman's blazer hanging off her. Now this was clearly a lady's fashion item,
Yeah.
but it was at least 3 sizes too big for her. Now no doubt she has bought the correct size for her frame, but it was designed to look oversized. It was designed to look like you put your dad's coat on. And I wonder why there's this sort of thread running through the history of this, that tailoring in particular is a thread that runs through every generation from the 50s onward, from my own parents' generation to today.
It's the one thing we share. We all have to get dressed. You know, I mean, it's...
Francis.
Sorry.
A couple of things. Well, one thing is just a joke thing. When you showed that vision from what we'd be wearing in the 1950s, was anybody else's reaction, God, it'd be cold in that? It's totally practical for most of the weather, unless they're anticipating climate change.
Yeah.
Very early. Yeah, that's my first thought.
I think it was meant to communicate that people were wearing the less covered in 35 layers already by the teens, and so they thought on trend they'll be half naked, which
Preempting
was not wrong in the summer.
preempting global warming, I assume.
Yes.
Sorry, can I just say, I mean, it's interesting you picked on the 1980s, because as you're right, we came of age in that sense, but actually my memory is much more of the 1970s as being an age of, you know, that kind of reproduction of styles of the past. So I remember my stepfather had the tailored suits with the kind of Tommy Nutter type thing, with the wide lapels,
Yes.
the waistcoats, and apart from the excessively flared trousers, it was a real 90s.
It was inspired by the 30s, was it?
Yeah,
Like the
30s,
late
20s, yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah,
So there was a strong thread of that running through the 70s as well, which we could pick up on.
Because you had it in Bieber and
Yeah,
had
absolutely.
the popularity of the Great Gatsby film.
But the other thing was, I think you missed was humour. There was humour in your presentation, obviously, but I mean, if you think about the chat, the sort of from the surreal, at least starting with a certain degree of self-deprecation through to surrealism,
Yes.
through to absurdism, that an important aspect of what Chappism, as many of us experience it, is that sense of the absurdity of it.
Yes.
The absurdity of not only the way we present ourselves, but the fact of existence more generally.
Yes.
You see that in the Olympiad and things like that. So I think that's another strong thread running through this.
So I have those 4 things that, and the 5th one that's maybe missing is the idea of just taking the Mickey, the humor side of it.
Yeah, with a purpose.
The other thing I wanted to mention was you didn't mention the 80s pop and the Renew Romantics. They were very going back to the smart.
It was just a brief.
It was very brief.
brief
Yeah.
in it, but
And
yeah,
even
it
people
was
like
mentioned.
the Depeche Mode and things like
Yeah.
that, who wore ties.
Kraftwerk.
and
No, you're right, I should have said.
Yeah,
It was a short
Kraftwerk
time,
and
but
so
it
on.
was very
Because this got influenced by the New Romantics.
Yeah.
Definitely. This
Yeah,
this
they-
change was
brief
influenced by New
moment,
Romantics.
Yes, yeah, they had this particular hairstyle as well.
Yeah,
Almost like
ABC.
Stuart's brother had it, a bob only on one side and things like that.
I think you're probably all bored of hearing me say this, but you know, I come from a land down under, and you know, we're frightfully informal.
We forgive
And I think so. Chappism, like in places like Australia and New Zealand, where I'm from originally, you know, is a rebellion against just how intensely informal those societies are. It's like, no, actually, we did have a bit of style back in the. You look at pictures of New Zealand and Australia in their 20s. People did wear suits. They didn't wear stubbies and singlets. They actually did dress properly. They did have picnics. They did, and they still did things like have votes for women and build the welfare state in the first countries in the world to do some of these things. And. So it's sort of like, but then again, it's also taken the mickey a bit because yes, Britain is the colonial master and all that sort of thing. So it's all a bit of a mix. So sort of like when I got into Chappism down under, it was all part of that. It was sort of rebelling against the intense
And like what you said, and what Ed said, that now that I suppose now that it's no longer at some point in 10, 20 years, if anyone's still doing this, it would be so historically separate from the time when. The boss man was dressed like this, that you would see people from all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of races, all kinds of countries, like there's a great scene for this in Japan, and people of different ethnicities getting involved in this and not, feeling that somehow they're sort of, internalizing colonialism, but they're just doing something that they like, and
Continental, worldwide, though, we do see a lot of people copying that sort of Chappism movement, because now there's a tweed run in many different countries, for example, and there's a lot more of this coming out now in different countries around Europe and around the world, in America, and so.
Despite the fact that eccentricity is much less tolerated in the continent.
It's still going to be there, I think.
There's an Art Deco festival in Napier,
There you
New
go.
Zealand, because that was a city that got destroyed in
Yeah,
earthquakes
yes,
in the 1930s, and they rebuilt in an Art Deco
That's a
style. It
huge
looks
event,
great.
huge event.
And I'd love to. For some weird reason I never went, but I keep meaning to go.
Me too.
I'll get around to it. But yeah, so
But yeah, worldwide it's alive. It's alive worldwide.
But in my hometown, got destroyed by earthquakes, and they've rebuilt in a terrible, glass, concrete, horrible style. So it's just
I've met a few super creative sort of artists. I met a neurosurgeon, and she could be super glamorous, but in her work she doesn't let people know what she does because it's quite respectable. But she looks absolutely amazing, and she's very artistic, and the transformation is absolutely amazing.
You don't want to look rebellious if you're in your research.
She doesn't want
when
to
you're
look rebellious
working.
with her colleagues.
It's not reassuring.
She'll lose all credibility. Well, she does. Yeah, she wants to keep the two lives separate, basically.
I remember saying this to you when we wanted the walk, the flaneurs, and I would be wary of people taking my photograph against my colleagues.
I remember you saying that.
Yeah, because wearing a tie or a suit in the university, even in a business school, you would just not be taken seriously.
Yeah, and you weren't wearing something.
Well, I was wearing something more than a suit and a tie.
No, but I mean, it wasn't. You didn't have a pith helmet
No,
and
yeah.
a riding. No, things that could be misinterpreted.
No,
You were just.
those are for home crime.
Okay. Anyway, moving on.
But, yeah.
Yeah, it was really great. I mean, I did try and decontextualise it all over the years. You're right, you start with Teddy Boys, it's an aspiration whereby they're aping Savile Row's style, and it's going to sort of the everyman and new culture and things like that. The casuals also did that, but were taking a leap too far forward. But I've always thought that Chappism owed a great deal to both punk and mod, specifically. Mod, because it's all about the detail. If a cuff hasn't got 4 buttons, I'm not interested. It's all about that sort of thing, I mean,
Yes.
you can call it pedantic, but by the same token, you can also call it particular. One person's pedant is another person's, and then the punk aspect of it is also to do with the fact that it's sort of like countercultural, because people don't dress like this anymore. sort of say, oh well,
Yeah.
there's examples of
If
it.
you deliberately
The idea of having an event where you have to wear a tie,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, it's like the MCC, Ricks, or here. That's pretty much it, really. I mean, it's there's nowhere else.
It was one of the things that struck me when I started meeting more people at the NSC, how many people had been involved, you know, in punk and golf and all these things. And as you say, it made sense though, because not afraid to stand out
No,
and be a bit rebellious and say, oh,
and once
because
again,
no one else does
there's
this.
the aspiration side of it that goes all the way back to Teddy Boys, whereby, I've been at this for years, that's before it even existed, you know, it's, but, you know, in one way or another. But people sort of say, what's it all about? I say, well, it's classy but classless. You know, you don't have to, anybody can basically, you know, I mean, provided you sort of like wear it with some panache, you understand what it's all about. You know, I mean, you know, all you need is a tweed jacket and a pair of brogues, and you can basically sort of like, you know, off you go. It's
not expensive.
It's not expensive per se. You just got to sort of understand that it's about natural, you know, all that type of stuff.
In the Preppy Handbook, there's a phrase that I think really helped her make a fortune. Liz Vernack wrote, you know, and she was being facetious, but I think also partly serious. In a democracy, everyone can be upper class. And of course, economically, that's not true, right? But people don't have to act like, you know. I mean, you have to be, and you know, when I was writing about in Wonderland City, you know, one of the things that I won't say I was concerned about, but I consider it is that some of those places are not cheap, you know. But then again, you don't go every day. You don't have breakfast there every day unless you're some plutocrat. You know, I think unless you know, there are people that can't get to the end of the month, and then that's the case. Then you're screwed. But you've always been screwed. I mean, it's not a new thing. You know, Chappism doesn't make it worse. But if you're in some sort of employment, you know, once a year you can go to the Wolseley. I mean, you know, and you can go to vintage shop and get clothes for very reasonable money, and I think that's good. Yeah.
And just with reference to what you had on the screen at the moment, at home, had I known what you were presenting on, I would have worn it. I have an Scutum jacket and waistcoat that are part of what is known as the Bowie suit.
Okay.
Now, this would not have been a cheap item for anybody going
No.
along to Scutum who was buying that suit in the late 80s, but it was aspirational to give yourself that look of the thin white duke in this little cropped waistcoat. And it's a perfectly plain black jacket and waistcoat, really.
You mentioned the New Romantics, you know, and you know, what was the name of the chap that organized some of the clubs? You know, he just raided, you know, used clothing shops. So he did a different look every week, but didn't have any money. And he was able, so obviously you can go high road and you know, and go, you know, there are people in the club that have Savile suits, but then there are people that have much cheaper stuff.
It's the same point you're making about the Wolsey and what have you. It's something that, for a chap of that time, an aspirational thing that he would have saved and saved and saved and saved and saved to be able to go on. And that's if he was a Bowie fan.
I think the mods had that, right? Some of the mods that they would save their, and the teddies, you know, save their pennies and buy.
But it reminds you of that Pete Needham phrase, you know, clean living. Modern is about clean living under difficult circumstances. And it's a cliche, but it's a state of mind. You know, I mean, you say you can do it down at a local thrift shop, you can do it in Savile Row. It's about trying to state, I think, to yourself and what your worth in the world, and say, look, I'm as good as you. I can do this. I can be like this. And I can experience work, and I can understand these restaurants and this food, and I don't need to have that background upbringing.
Yeah.
I can recreate myself, and I think that's what the mods did, what the Ten Boys did, what the Goths did, and that's run right throughout, not just working class, but youth culture.
And that's a great thing of late 20th century progressivism, right? The idea that, you know,
the ability to reinvent.
why does it have to be just serving people? You know,
Yeah, but all those are the ones that people remember fondly. That you look at, so you look at Scutum nowadays. It has totally rebranded itself because it was adopted by football hooligans in the sort of like early mid-80s. Same way as Burberry scarves and all that type of thing. And if you look at their website now, it's basically it's purely advertised by football hooligans and chic. There's no trench coats out there. It's all sort of yobbos and sort of going down, you know, and all that type of thing. and yet there's the same level of aspirational sort of dressing, whereby, you know, there's what are we wearing? LS and Tuccini and things like that. It cost an absolute fortune in the 1980s, female tracksuit tops. You know, I mean, it's all become retro, come all the way round, and yet all that Scooter now are doing nowadays is basically effectively selling football. Just look at the website. I mean, it's quite amazing. We've got Aqua Scooter back to something like that.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's
like when Polo started doing these massive ponies on their shirt, then fit on the shirt. That was really tacky.
yes, but it's all down once again to aspirational dressing. It's just people love the chaps, but they don't love the football.
No.
Well, I went on the Barber website and recently, and, you know, I do live in Hampshire, and you do actually need a decent barber jacket, but the stuff they're selling now is way too short. It's you know, I can't fit it over my suit jacket. It's just like, what's going on?
Yeah, I'm not sure what happened with that. It's the same period that where trousers got super tight. Now they're super baggy again, but so the coats got shorter than jackets. They're sort of like bolero jackets for guys, you know, with a winter coat that ends at midriff. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense.
They said that in the 60s about the mods who were wearing bun-freezer jackets. You know, so this constantly.
Oh yeah. I mean that's just the business, right?
Yeah, that's.
So they sold everybody super tight trousers, and you got them. Okay, no, now they're wide. Throw those away. That's just
But the mod's also made a Belgian army coat. One of the most expensive things that you can buy if you can buy a genuine one in your local army and navy. Yeah, I've been there.
I've got Denison, like if you get into Militario, which I think is a crossover to Chappism, which I'm kind of into because, you know, I was, you know, into some of the nonsense I used to be into. But, you know, if you want to collect a World War II paratroopers jacket, you'd be like thousands of pounds now. You know, it's for a genuine article. Whereas, you know, a couple of decades ago, it would have been like, you know,
I've still got my park from when I was in Northern, so we tell me it's worth
Speaking of uniforms, this VE Day thing, you know,
yeah.
I mean, we lost.
No thought has gone into it yet.
Anyway, I think we're probably all done, I think.
Yeah.
Well done.